this is not the first time that I've spoken with Regina. We have actually had a discussion some months ago looking at statistics and her book, Fishman's Fraud, which I'll get her to show. But it's important to talk with experts who understand statistics because it is so difficult for the general public and even much of the scientific community to understand. And what it means is that without independent adjudication of the data, we can easily be fooled by statistics. So I really appreciate it when anyone who has expertise is able to look at data and make sense of it. And specifically, what I'd been looking at, and I'd asked Regina to take a look to give some ideas, was some information coming out from Norway with regards to their mortality statistics around COVID. And I knew instinctively as I looked at it, and as usual, if you're following the narrative, it's talking about how wonderful the intervention is and how many lives were saved. And I'm saying that I am specifically interested in certain problems, especially for the cohorts who are not having ongoing vaccinations. So when I looked at the data, it was difficult for me. So what do? I get an expert. And so with great pleasure, I've got Regina here with me. Regina, I will just ask you to just do a quick introduction of yourself so that people know who you are, and don't forget to show us Fishman's Fraud.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me back, Philip. I really appreciate being invited back onto your channel. So my background is I have a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Physics and a Master's and a PhD in Statistics. And throughout the pandemic, my main, what I've mainly been working on is looking at the different studies and noticing the misuse of statistics. So I've been trying to crack down on bogus modeling, manipulated statistics, and exposing what they're really being used for. So my book, I did write a book called Fishman's Fraud, The Rise of Canadian Hate Science. And this basically discussed a specific case of modeling, a specific model that was used to basically say that the unvaccinated pose a disproportionate risk to others. And this study was used to scapegoat unvaccinated Canadians and to prop up vaccine mandates and travel restrictions and the passports, and also to vilify a large portion of the population. So I exposed this. My intent wasn't actually to write a book. I did go to the journal and asked for the paper to be retracted, but they stood by the paper. I went to the University of Toronto where the research took place. I proved the fraud to them, and they refused to investigate. And after that, I went to the funding agency. It was funded by Canada, the feds, and it was used in Canadian Parliament as justification to continue with restrictions. And instead of doing anything, they continued to fund those researchers. And since then, they've even funded additional, basically bogus modeling and papers. In fact, I actually had to update my companion guide. I have Fishman's Fraud, The Accomplices, and this gives all my letters to the different organizations. And the update provides the new letters that I had to send out because they continue to fund this this bogus research. So that's what I've been up to. It's actually pretty busy because there's no end
Wonderful.
to manipulation.
You know, I think that one of the things that, as you talk about this now, I'm thinking about what's coming out in terms of the United States, what's happening with the Dodge and the funding that is going through USAID to all of these things. And it's making you realize that there does seem to be an agenda that is being funded to support data and statistics that follow a narrative. And the big narrative at the moment seems to be to protect the integrity, not of vaccines, but of the COVID vaccine. And I have long said that they almost are willing to sacrifice public trust of all vaccines just to protect this one cohort of vaccines. And it's unbelievable because the statistics seem to be so far out.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to say there. I know in Canada, there's been an immense amount of money poured into combating so-called vaccine hesitancy. Um, and it's actually sad because now people don't trust the older vaccines anymore. But they do have to push this through, Philip, because as you know, they want to um, depend more and more on mRNA technology, right? Even for other vaccines. So I think that's why they still have to keep pushing it, because this is the way they want to go. They want to go towards mRNA. So they need to salvage this COVID narrative.
Yeah, this is a real issue because, and it then makes sense as to why there is so much pressure being applied to convince the public that what they are seeing is not real. Because that's effectively what they're doing. They're saying that if you see people who are getting COVID and are dying or having complications from the pandemic, if it seems as though it's related to highly vaccinated regions, it's in your imagination. It's not real because the statistics tell us that everything is going great. How, from a statistical point of view, as a statistician, how can that happen?
Pretty easily, actually. I mean, I look at it, and you're right, Philip. It's been massive gaslighting. And when I look at the statistics, well, the main function, unfortunately, especially here in Canada, but even worldwide, the main function here has been manipulating statistics and bogus modeling for the purpose of, number one, propaganda, the gaslighting that you speak of; two, to justify unconstitutional measures; and then three, of course, it's to give protection to authority, so they can say we were just following the science, so they don't even have to be held to account. So those are the main reasons of the main uses that I've seen of statistics during the pandemic, which is really sad because with my training and everything, statistics to me was always a tool to get to the truth, right? So when you use it in the proper way, in its pure form, you can, you investigate what's happening, you can get to the truth of the matter. It's fantastic. But during the pandemic, that's not how it's been used. And the way they've gotten away with it, of course, is the extreme censorship. Because if you had open scientific debate, this would never happen. These bogus studies would be crushed because a lot of the flaws are very, very, very obvious.
And so for the audience, what we have been talking about is this particular study. So this is a preprint, and when it came out, they were looking at the Norway population between 2021 and 2023, looking at the outcomes in terms of all-cause mortality. Now, that's what caught my attention, all-cause mortality. And the reason it caught my attention is that very often, in terms of previous data, they only spoke about COVID mortality. And I was saying that, hold on, just talking about COVID mortality is not adequate. You need to tell me all-cause mortality, because if they didn't die of COVID, but died of something else related to the COVID intervention, we also need to know. And so all-cause mortality was always the gold standard. And for one of the first times, we were getting population data on all-cause mortality. But straight away, when I read the paper, as you can imagine, this paper was talking about how protective it was against all-cause mortality. So I knew straight away there was going to be a red flag, but I'm not a statistician. And so I sent this paper to Regina. I said, listen, can you take a look at this and try and figure out what is it that they have done? And you got a chance to look at it. And for those who are listening, there will be a link to Substack, my Substack, which then has her Substack, which has a full breakdown of of it and really helps to understand what she's saying. But here is the point that I wanted you to be aware of. The conclusion here: vaccinated individuals have a lower rate of all-cause death during the period 2021 to 2023 in Norway. That is a huge statement, because what it was therefore indicating is that if you were vaccinated, you were less likely to die, not just of COVID, but of any other mortality, being hit by a bus, dying in an avalanche, always less if you have been vaccinated. So how did you look at that data, Regina? How did you approach it?
Well, I did a couple things. First, I just read through the paper that you sent me, Philip, and made my own observations straight away. So as a statistician, I could look at this paper and say, well, it's interesting, but their model was very, very simplistic. It was insufficient to really attribute any cause to the vaccines itself. So the differences that we saw were basically due to inherent biases between the two groups. That was my assessment when I looked at it, but I realized that that would kind of ring hollow to most people without a deeper explanation. So then I decided to write a Substack, because I felt this was a very important conversation to have. So these studies, all-cause mortality by vaccine status, a lot of them sprung out, I think, because of the whole debate about whether these vaccines saved lives or cost lives. So, that spectrum that we've seen play out, we've seen that some studies, some modeling studies have claimed that the vaccine saved like 20 million lives. Well, that study there by the Lancet claiming 20 million lives saved in the first year of the vaccine, the vaccine rollout, those are easy to destroy. Those studies are so ridiculous. They're complete. They're just an imaginary modeling to give us imaginary benefits. So then we see studies coming out by, say, Denis Rancourt, who's been looking at all-cause mortality, and he points out, as do many others, that you do see this increase in excess all-cause mortality as the vaccines were rolled out. And so that looks very bad for these vaccines when you see that kind of temporal correlation. So then the establishment is quick to say that, correlation does not equal causation, and you can't say it's just because of the vaccines, because other things were going on. And that's true, but it still looks very, very bad, because you do see this trend, and not just in one place, but in many countries. So then you have studies coming out and saying, okay, we're going to look at all-cause mortality by vaccine status. So with Denis Rancourt's work, that breakdown, he didn't use that breakdown. He just had all-cause mortality, for example, and he looked at overall trends. So when they do the all-cause mortality by vaccine status, the Norway study says that, oh, look at the vaccinated group has a lower all-cause mortality incidence than the unvaccinated group. And if you look at what you just said, Philip, with that concluding remark there, if you want to pull that back up, they're not actually saying that it's due to the vaccines, but they strongly imply it throughout their entire paper. All right, vaccinated individuals had a lower rate of all-cause death during 21 to 2023 in Norway. Okay, but they're not saying that that is due to the vaccines itself. But when you go through the paper, it's highly suggested that it is, and it doesn't give you any reason to believe it's something else. So what I do is I go through what is actually happening in Norway to give people a sense of how to look at the data to kind of figure out what the study's actually saying. So the first thing I do is I look at just plots. What's happening in Norway? How did the cases go during, throughout the pandemic? Were there any trends, and what was happening? So if we look at we start there with the raw data. Do you want to pull up maybe some graphs, Philip?
So from your Substack, just so that everyone sees, this is the Substack, and I'll be leading you to it. There will be something in the description which will help you to see where this full breakdown from Regina is about this COVID vaccine narrative. So which image would you like me to start with?
Well, this one is pretty good. This just kind of gives, I just go and I look at the data from very, different angles. So that first plot there, the top left, yes, that's just the number of COVID-19 cases per million in Norway. And I have a line there showing when 75% of the population had received at least one dose. So prior to that, there were very few COVID cases in Norway. And then after that point is when you see a huge spike in the COVID cases, and that those peaked, I think it's January, February of 2022. So that's a huge peak in the early months of 2022 with Omicron. The next graph, you see the COVID-19 hospitalizations per million. Again, you see the line where there's 75% of the population had received at least one dose. And you do see that there is a rise in hospitalizations after that time. It did not go down. So one of the selling points of the COVID vaccine is they would see a reduction in hospitalization. Well, their overall trend was an increase. And then the lower left, you see the COVID-19 deaths per million. And again, after the vaccination rollout, then you see a lot of deaths in, 2022, the end of 2021 and into 2022. And then the graph to the lower right, you're looking at your all-cause mortality. And so what the graph shows is when you look at the trends prior to the pandemic and you look at the expected mortality that you would have, then you look at the access, and you see that there was no real access mortality until after the vaccine rollout. Right there, I have the 75% of the population with at least one dose. You see a rise, but that rise actually starts there at about 50% of the population had one dose. So if you go to the very, that's when you actually see the rise beginning. So you didn't actually see a rise in, this is the cumulative number of access all-cause deaths, and you don't see that increase until, midway through the vaccine rollout. So when you look at that, it doesn't look good for the vaccines. So at that point, I start looking at, other things too. What could be driving these trends? So do you want to pull out, I'll just go through the graphs and the next couple of graphs. I just look at any data available.
This one here?
Oh, sure. Well, we'll just go step by step. So then I started looking at, okay, the other graphs showed the point of time where we had 75% of the population had at least one dose. But what was happening in the fall of 2021 was Norway was distributing its booster doses. So on the left side, we see the number of booster doses administered. And the interesting thing is that the rise in COVID cases started happening about 7 weeks after the booster doses started being administered. So the graph to the right shows the weekly confirmed COVID cases. And you see there, December, January, February is when you see that big peak in COVID cases. So that coincides more or less with the booster campaign. So the boosters are rolled out. 7 weeks later, you see this huge rise in COVID cases, and the pink line there is the cumulative number of cases from the beginning. So you see, right. So I thought this is really interesting. So I thought that is a striking similarity in the rise of cases when you compare it to the rise of the number of booster doses. So then I did another graph where I overlaid the cumulative COVID cases with the cumulative boosters given out. So
So
if you
this
want,
is this one here.
right, this is amazing. So all I did was take that graph that showed the cumulative number of cases, and I pushed it 7 weeks back so that they coincided. And you see that the rise is almost identical. The rise in timing is almost identical between
Wow.
the two. So then when I look at this, I would say you'd be very, very hard pressed to say that the COVID vaccines protected you against COVID because, it's the rise in the cases is eerily similar to the rise in the number of boosters. So remember, the boosters happened 7 weeks
Just
before.
pausing you here a minute. So when I want you to just put on your other hat. So imagine that you're on the other side and you are protecting the narrative. How would you explain that? What would you say?
Well, the only thing that really you would say is, the whole correlation does not mean causation, and it doesn't. Just because you rolled out these boosters and 7 weeks later you see a rise in cases, and that rise exactly coincides almost precisely with the boosters, it doesn't mean that the boosters caused it. So that is true. But good luck telling people that the boosters or the vaccines protected you. I mean, that it would be a very hard sell to say that there's any protective mechanism here when you see something like that. I mean, you can try, but it's very difficult to sell that narrative.
I want you to explain something to the audience here, because we hear it all the time. Somebody points a gun at somebody and they shoot at them. The bullet hits the person may die, but correlation does not mean causation. That makes sense. People keep, I know it's true in some instances, but can you just explain to us, how is it that
in this
correlation
case, so to your point, okay, what the first thing I would say if I was defending the narrative, and what you would say is that, well, Omicron hit, and you've seen this rise at around that time everywhere. So it's not just because they rolled out their boosters right before, right? So that's what I would claim. I'd say, you know what, Omicron came, and yes, that happened everywhere in Norway. It just happened to be right after, or during the booster rollout.
And okay, so could one argue then that it's pretty clear from that the vaccines didn't protect against Omicron?
So I would so on the counter, I'd say, okay, I can't say that it caused the cases, but it sure doesn't look like it protected the cases. And the interesting thing is just the rise in the timing. I was actually shocked to see that it was almost an exact match in terms of the rise. But that's something you don't see very often. But they're right that you cannot say that the boosters caused it. But I would say, well, it shows the boosters didn't really do much to protect it. That's a very hard sell there for me when I look at that.
Yeah, it's difficult, and I understand what people say when they say that, but I mean, the purpose, especially because they mandated the vaccine. You could get away if you didn't mandate the vaccine and say, well, you were protecting people, you'd have to see if it was correlated with mortality. But it's pretty clear that it did not work at all, really, against protecting through infection from Omicron. And I think that's a pretty reasonable correlation to say that it didn't work against protecting against infection.
It is, and they might claim, oh no, you can't conclude it on its own. But then it's like, well, it's not on its own though, because if you look at data, in the UK, when it looked like the group had higher infection rates than the unvaccinated. You've seen that in Canada, that the vaccinated during that time had higher infection rates than the unvaccinated. And when you look at the Cleveland study that came out and showed, basically the more shots you get, the more likely you are to get infected. There's a lot of data not just this one thing, but there's a lot of data showing that not only did it not stop infections, but it looks like it increased infections. So it's not just this one study, but I just wanted to put it out there that when you say correlation doesn't mean causation, they're very lucky that's the case, because it would look very bad, very, very bad for them if it was. But I don't want to suggest that, because of the boosters they got it, but it's like, it is a hard sell to say they were protecting. They were protected.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, right. So moving on with your Substack, then you then right. have cumulative excess deaths per 100,000 in people in Norway. What was this about?
Okay, so we already saw, like from the similar graph here, we had shown that in Norway, you didn't really see an increase in cumulative access all-cause mortality until about halfway through the vaccine period. So I just wanted to show on this graph the point where only 10% of the population had at least one dose, and where the majority had one dose, the 75%. And in the middle there, like I said, at about 50%, you started seeing the rise. And then overlaid with this is the confirmed COVID-19 deaths, right? So you see that the all-cause mortality, the access all-cause mortality continued even when the COVID deaths, plateaued. So something more than COVID was going on. That's what this tends to look like, right? There's something more than just COVID that can be, driving these access deaths. And so then there's yep, go ahead.
But just pause there a second. So that's very powerful. These, and as I said to people, please click on the Substack to take a detailed look at this. But so that's pretty powerful, because what it's indicating is that more people were dying, but they weren't dying of severe COVID. Is that about a reasonable extrapolation, looking at the data again, especially towards the end? This period here, this is the cumulative excess deaths per 100,000. Right. This is the numbers that were dying with COVID. And if it was normal, they should be about similar trajectories.
Well, basically, it's saying that even when the deaths plateaued, you still had excess deaths happening in Norway, and you have to think, why do you have these excess deaths? They're not attributable. It doesn't look like they're attributable to just COVID, because they persisted even when the COVID deaths subsided. So yeah, there's something else. It looks like something else is going on here, is what this graph would suggest.
Just to be clear, this here axis is looking at the amounts per 100,000. So in a normal situation, it would be somewhere just above the zero. Imagine if we didn't have COVID and it was 2018, this orange line would be hovering just around zero, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's what we would have expected, around zero, because these are the access are the ones that are above, what we expected. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So it doesn't come back down.
Yeah. So I guess this period here is the normal period. This here is the abnormal period. And
like you said, this normal period, this is, 2020 still to 2021. So the pandemic was going on during this first part. There just wasn't, any access deaths really that were happening.
And so, okay, again, I want you to take on the head of the opposite side, so to speak. Defend that. How do you explain that?
Oh, that's a little bit more nuanced, right? One thing you can say is, well, how did they estimate access deaths? You can go into that methodology. That wouldn't do too much, because a lot of different people have looked at access mortality, different methods, and you still see increases after the vaccine rollout across different countries. That I think is the sticky point. This is why they have to look and try to. I'll put it this way. The interesting thing with a lot of these studies, Philip, is that they conclude that it wasn't the vaccines, but they don't try to tell you what it was, right? They don't actually, they just say it's anything except the vaccines. Okay?
Yeah,
Well, that's one
that's
of
a great.
right? And that's actually a big problem because I'm like, okay, because people are like, okay, if it's not the vaccines, what is it? And they're kind of like silent, right? And I think this is a big, big problem for them.
Yeah, it is. It is. That is. And actually, just recently, I was going to create a joke about that. The AT anything but the ABTV, and where people will say, "We don't know what it is, but we know it's not this."
Yes, that's the whole thing, and that's the problem because people are like not satisfied. They're like, guys, what is it, right? Um, so actually, so then the next graph, I go to the,
Yeah.
there was a paper.
Sorry, let me just get back to the Substack here. So yeah, so when you do the next graph here, you're talking about cumulative excess death mortality by cause of death.
Right. So first, I have to say that these graphs, I do say in the Substack where I got them. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's not that I generated these things. I go to papers and I see what the different papers are saying.
And this is for Norway, is it? This is Norway.
This is for Norway. So, and I apologize for not having the name of this paper on hand.
Is it on the Substack?
It is on my Substack. All the links are on my
so,
Substack. Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
I just want to put it out there that I'm not generating these graphs. I'm just taking it, you know, them from papers. And I think the above graphs, a lot of them were Our World in Data. So you can easily go on there and get those exact same graphs. So in this paper, they looked at cumulative excess mortality by cause of death. And you see, you know, cancer, you know, cardiovascular disease, and you see like COVID. So you see that, you know, there's a lot of other things going on other than COVID. And apart from COVID, one of the main, I guess, contributors of this excess mortality has been cardiovascular disease. So
just so we understand, if it's below the line here, does it mean that there are less for respiratory?
Than they expected, less than expected. So you have
less,
a reduction in respiratory,
people have
but
died with COVID. Yes, that makes sense. So
right,
the people who died with COVID a lot of them would have respiratory disease, so less would have died with pure respiratory disease. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent way to look at it, actually, Philip. It's like, yeah, they're dying of COVID instead of other respiratory illnesses that we would have expected anyway.
Yeah.
Right. And then apart from that, the cardiovascular diseases you've seen the biggest increase in excess deaths. So that's to the right. And again, you see that, you know.
Oh, this one here.
Yeah,
so this
to the right.
is cardiovascular disease here.
That's the cumulative. The green is the cumulative, and then the horizontal lines that's the access. So you see a persistent access in cardiovascular disease in Norway.
Just to clarify this so that everybody understands. So in the right image, so let's bring it up again. You are saying that for cardiovascular diseases between January 2020 and October 2020, it remained elevated, but this is relatively flat, isn't it? So it's above zero all the way through even in the early part of the pandemic. Does that mean anything? Would you have expected it to come down?
No, I'm just remember, people wanted to know why you're seeing an excess in all-cause mortality. They try to look at it by what people were dying from, and they're saying, well, it looks like the excess mortality, a lot of it is an increase in cardiovascular disease.
Okay, why there's an increase, clarify this so that the audience understands it. So the dotted line here at the bottom is the lower limit for what you expect. The green, the dark blue line here is the predicted, and then the orange line is what was observed. And what we're seeing is that it has always been higher than your prediction from
Well,
about. Mhm.
yeah, from about where? In the beginning it was, and they were pretty much
Yes,
similar,
it
the
was okay here,
predicted. Yep.
but starting, well, I guess up to January 2021, about okay, and then by about March of 2021, it starts to diverge and remains elevated and above the upper limit, the dotted line here. So this is quite significant, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I should have explained that a little better. Yeah, you're right. These horizontal lines are observed versus predicted. And like you said in the beginning, they are, very similar. But as you go out, you do see an elevation in what you expected.
And this is for cardiovascular diseases. So this
Right.
is fitting with what everybody is observing. As I said, you know, because I do what I call social listening, so I do respond to comments and so on. People are just saying this all the time. This person died. This person is in hospital. This person had a sudden, they're just going on, and everybody's thinking, well, this could just be anecdotal. You could just be looking for it. The same number of people were dying all the time. You've just noticed it more since the pandemic. This kind of data, however, confirms that people are dying from cardiovascular events at a much higher rate than was previously happening before the pandemic.
Well, there was this paper is saying that there was a significant increase in cardiovascular deaths. Yes, that's what the paper is saying. That's what their analysis is saying. And then, of course, you're going to have the one side saying that, well, we know that, autopsies confirm that there is a link between the vaccines and cardiovascular injury. And you have the other group saying you can't necessarily say that's the cause.
Yeah, this is the problem, is that there is this ongoing standoff saying that, well, you can't prove that it was the vaccines, but it's a reasonable question to say, well, if it wasn't, what is it?
Well, the issue that they have is that it's you do have a link. There is I think it's an acknowledged link between cardiovascular injury and death and the vaccines. The whole question is, what is the magnitude, right? So they did not do the proper tracking to really estimate that to within a good degree of certainty, right? So then you look at these things and then you're saying, well, from this population level data, you have one side saying, oh, it could be as high as, and they give a number. And then the other group saying, oh, no, correlation doesn't equal causation. But the issue there is that those saying that these vaccines were safe and effective, the onus of proof is on them to show it. And they should have been tracking it. And we do know there's a link, right? And so now we do have to look at maybe population level data to try to estimate the magnitude. So for them to come back and say, you can't say for sure, it's like, well, no, but we can give these estimates. And it could be this, and if it is, then that's problematic.
So I'm going to say something now, and based on what we're talking about statistically. So I oftentimes talk about one of the most important papers I'd come across. I did a whole course around this paper because it was so important, where they looked at PET scans and the use of glucose in the heart. And it was pretty clear that a significant proportion of people after being vaccinated, I think it was up to 30%, the heart changed the way that it used glucose. Now, inflammation can do that, but we don't know what the mechanism is. So what I think is happening is that we are having what I call the COVID storm. And the COVID storm is based on the principle that the primary driver for health-related conditions, especially autoimmunity, is the spike protein. It doesn't matter where it comes from. If you have, and so this is now how I break down the difference between populations. So if you had a country like Papua New Guinea, they are only 4.5% vaccinated. So they would have had COVID and some of them would have died, but the population hit herd immunity. And what that means is that they have stopped circulating COVID. And even if they were exposed, they would probably not get what I call a systemic infection. The virus doesn't get into the bloodstream. It may infect their upper airways, but that's it. But in the highly vaccinated populations who have been immune primed, who can't control the circulating infection, what we are seeing is a cumulative impact of spike protein exposure, first from the vaccine, then from recurring infections, which then drives inflammatory processes like the cardiovascular things. Would that be, from the data, could that be a reasonable assumption that what we're seeing here is not just vaccination, but vaccination combined with infection?
Well, that's why you have to be careful with the correlation doesn't equal causation, because right now you're talking about, well, it could not just be the vaccine. You're, like you said, it could be the combination with infection and other things. So what you are giving is plausible mechanisms by which we can see what we're seeing. And those are very valid. The issue is on the other side that they can't say that what you're saying isn't happening, right? So, and I have a big issue with the fact that they could have been doing the proper studies. They have been choosing not to, and just saying, you can't exactly prove exactly what's happening, but they are not doing the research that they could be doing to show these vaccines are safe. And I think we know why. There's enough evidence that shows these vaccines are not safe. So, but I'm not sure if that answers the question, Philip. But
yeah, I know. It's just trying to think through, because go ahead.
Well, I leave it to the doctors and the physicians then to look at, and the virologists and the immunologists to come up with why we would see this physically, right? So that's not my area to attribute the biological mechanism. So I refer, like I look at you guys and say, okay, why can this happen? And that's where you're.
Then we come up with the theories, and then you have to prove. This is frightening, because we are 4 years into the rollout of the vaccines, and we are still struggling to find data one way or the other. And for anyone who is saying that, listen, this was great, I'm saying that the fact that you have to try and prove to me that this is good is a bad sign. It does mean it's clear. It's not, at most, it's very slight benefit. That's the best you could.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a lot of evidence come in that these vaccines are dangerous, and as the days go on, there's more and more evidence, and it always seems to be not in their favor. So the evidence shows that I don't see how they can possibly continue saying that these vaccines save more lives than they cost. There's just nothing to support that at all. And the evidence is overwhelmingly on the other side.
And so when we think about, there's something that I want you to mention, I'll go looking for it, but what happened with regards to Alberta in Canada? I didn't hear about this, but you had mentioned it before.
Okay, so yeah, when you asked me to look at this study, I kind of got I was looking at it and then I got sidetracked because a couple of weeks ago, a report came out here in Canada, and it was a report written for the government of Alberta. And this was basically the first time that views outside, or anything outside the dominant narrative were allowed. All right, so when they looked at the response of the Alberta government, the report found what you've been talking about for years now, Philip, and a lot of us, is that masking had no scientific justification. The mask mandates did not work, that the non-pharmaceutical interventions like school closures, lockdowns, and other restrictions, they were ineffective. They had a lot of costs, both socially and economically, with minimal benefits. And they talked about the double standards that were used when bringing in therapeutics, that when you had therapeutics like, well, it basically showed that the regulators favored the more expensive, less effective pharmaceuticals with questionable safety, like remdesivir, and they favored those and opposed the cheaper repurposed drugs that have, you know, a really good safety records and showed promise. So it talked about that double standard. And it also talked about how natural immunity was minimized, and that basically, in this report, it said Alberta Health spread disinformation about the vaccine's superior immunity to COVID, and that even when there was evidence showing they were wrong, they clung to those that lie. So it had all that in the report, but then what's really a stickler in this report is when they looked at the vaccines and pointed out some pretty obvious issues with them in terms of safety, toxicity, and then the shortcomings of the clinical trials. They basically came out and recommended that the vaccine use be halted in healthy children and teenagers. So they basically said, yeah, you shouldn't be giving these out anymore, and to our youth. And then they said for everybody else, you should have to disclose the risks. So that's the report that came out. It is getting traction in some circles, but obviously the establishment itself is strongly against this report because it goes against, you know, the dominant narrative that's been playing out around the world, especially in Canada.
You know, yeah, I hadn't heard about it, and I looked for things to try and make sense. So it does demonstrate that they really kept that pretty well suppressed. So I'll go looking for it now and talk about it. But as we come to the end here, Regina, I'm reflective of an important point. And what I say to people is that there is a battle going on, who is right, who is wrong. You know, I look at it a bit differently from a clinical point of view. There are a lot of people who are sick. There are a lot of people who are dying. There are a lot of loved ones who are being lost. And at the moment, there are no good answers. We don't have good data. We don't have good autopsy facts. The clinical community is blind. They're just stumbling along and hoping that this will kind of resolve itself. But here's the reality. I'm happy to say this because I think that this is, from what I've observed, this is the situation. In highly vaccinated regions, there is no way to stop Omicron circulation without actively intervening. And so what that means is that if my premise is right, that when people are spike immune primed, and now it's an important differentiation, even in a vaccinated person. So if somebody had, say, moderate COVID and they didn't have adequate immune protection through interferon autoantibodies and they got infection after infection, they could be at just as much risk as the person who had been vaccinated with recurring infection. Because it doesn't matter how the immune priming occurs, if you have recurring infection, it's driving inflammatory responses that will worsen all underlying diseases. And so I don't think that this can be avoided. So meaning that I genuinely think that those people hope it's going to go away and that there's going to be other things that will distract the public from looking at it. But this is a storm surge. It's just at our knees at the moment. Very soon it's going to be at our waist, and then it will be at our shoulders. And there will be no other option but to try and figure out what's happening. And when you do that, it has to lead all the way back to the spike protein. There is no way out. It's just a matter as to how long it takes us to acknowledge it and then try and figure out ways of mitigating it.
Okay. One thing probably, because I haven't even answered your question really about the study in terms of its final conclusions. Did you want me to basically summarize?
Yes, please. Yes.
Just because it's like people are like, well, but why is Norway not saying what it's saying? And so if you go through my Substack, the next after looking at those graphs, I now am trying to figure out, okay, what are the characteristics of the vaccinated group and the unvaccinated group? So I go through all the different factors all the different things that happened over the pandemic. And basically, I talk about all the confounding issues and that these two groups of individuals are very, very different and their characteristics change over time. So what I'm saying there is, like, if you look at the beginning of the vaccine rollout, the people who are in the unvaccinated group changed over time, right? Because in the beginning, the vaccines were mostly given out to healthcare workers, the elderly, people with comorbid conditions. And then over time, more and more people got vaccinated. So the characteristics of the unvaccinated group changed over time. Also, it was a voluntary uptake of the vaccines in Norway, and it was given out free, well, to anybody. But even so, you can see that in Norway, you did have some huge differences of the type of people who decided to take the vaccine and didn't, right? So you see huge differences in the immigration group. So certain immigrants, like immigrants from Poland and Latvia and places like that, had a much lower uptake than people from the Norwegian countries, for example, right? For example, Poland, I think it was like 45% got vaccinated by the fall of 2021 versus like 94% of Norwegians, sorry, right? So there's a huge difference in the immigration status. And why that's important is because with COVID, early on, it was shown that immigrants were more susceptible to COVID and more likely to die of COVID, right? So that's a confounding factor. And also you look at the social economic class and you see that there's differences between people who decided to vaccinate and not. So what I'm saying is there are very big differences in these groups. It's not just the vaccine that's the differences. There's other factors going on. And so you have very big group differences. And so then when you look at the Norwegian data and I look at, okay, did they account for the confounding? The answer is no. Did they account for what the all-cause mortality rates were in these groups before vaccination and look at the baseline? No, they didn't. And like I said before, they also didn't explain, well, what could be causing these increase in all-cause mortality. So you see there's some very big limitations to the Norwegian study. And you also look at in 2021, before the fall, there was very, very few COVID cases and very few deaths. So in 2021, you would not have much protection from the vaccines because there was no real cases and deaths. There was not very many, right? And then when you look at all-cause mortality, the COVID deaths played a very, very, very small role in 2021. I think only like 2% of the deaths were COVID related. So the magnitude of effect that you can get from these vaccines would be small. But yet when you look at the Norway model, when they ran their model, if you look at, say, for example, I think it's the 45 to 60 age group, you see that according to their model, the vaccinated had only had a 52% decrease in all-cause mortality. That's something that you cannot attribute to the vaccines. That's due to group differences. So what it actually shows is this. The only thing you can really conclude from this study is that the two groups are inherently different. The vaccinated and unvaccinated groups are inherently different. And it's not that difference that you see in all-cause mortality isn't due to vaccination. I'm not sure if I explained that well because I'm I'm
Yeah,
rushing it.
I think the point you're making is that, and as most of the public suspects, most of what is being said here is propaganda. It can't be proven, but it's being said as a fact when it's not proven, and it's not explaining the patterns that we are noticing. Because what is clear is that excess all-cause mortality is increasing, but we don't know exactly what the mechanism is. That's probably the most clear thing that has come out of the data.
It is, and what they're doing really is they're playing statistical games when they look at all-cause mortality by vaccine status. They're leading people to believe that it's not the vaccines, and when you just look at all-cause mortality, the vaccinated have lower rates. But those lower rates are not due to the vaccine. Those lower rates are due to group differences, inherent group differences. And you'll see that with many studies. But the issue is when they do their conclusions, they don't explain the nuances of modeling. They don't explain that, hey guys, it's not actually the vaccines of why we're seeing this. They know that's not that causing those differences, but they lead the public to believe that the vaccines are having this protective effect, and they don't explain themselves. And then if you go through my Substack, you'll see other studies that this points to, and all these studies show is there's an inherent bias in the data, and you cannot use the data the way they're saying. I wish I could explain it more, Philip, but that's the nuance of statistics.
The beauty for the public is that we have got that Substack here, which has all that explanation in here. And that's why I'm saying so valuable. And we really appreciate this work, Regina, really comprehensive look at it. And I think, therefore, that it allows people to take and look at it and make up their own minds as to what it is you're saying and your statistical analysis. So we really, really appreciate that, Regina. It's rare to find people with your kind of expertise willing to do that kind of dissection on this kind of data. So I considered it incredibly valuable. And as a final thing, show us your books again.
Okay. So the main book is Fisman's Fraud, The Rise of Canadian Hate Science. And I like to be as transparent as I possibly can when I do things. So then I put all the different letters I sent to the establishments and their responses and how things are playing out in this supplementary edition, supplementary guide. Yeah, you see that with me, Philip, when you ask me my opinion about this study and then I write an 18-page Substack. It's it's because I really want to bring people through the process so they can decide for themselves where things land and what makes sense. And so I do think it's important to be as clear as possible, and I do encourage people to read the analysis and make their own judgment. But I do appreciate having this time to talk about it, and I hope I didn't confuse anybody too much.
No, you didn't. Thank you very much, Regina. Wonderful to talk. I'm sure there's going to be more stuff we have to send your way. Thank you again. And for everyone listening, remember that at the end here in the description will be a link to the Substack where you will be then taken through the steps to get your own assessment of it, and hopefully the links to be able to get Regina's books as well on Amazon. So thank you very much, Regina. Really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me back, Philip. And thanks for bringing this study to my attention. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.